Hello, my name is Vanja Westerberg from Altus Impact. I'm very pleased to present you a study on the economics of sustainable pasture management on winter and village pastures in Kakheti in Georgia, done under the Economics of Land Degradation Initiative and together with Sarah Robinson, Emily Stebbings, Luis Costa and Pietro Vicetti. My objective with this presentation is to show you that there are pathways to recovery and improve productivity of winter and village pastures through 3 sustainable land management practices, and we will look at the economics of these. We will also give consideration to the legal and institutional issues that may need to be addressed, as well as the policy instruments that should be designed to ensure that pastoralists have sufficient incentives to invest in sustainable land management practices. To do this study, we used input from primary data, notably a household survey, secondary literature review, satellite imagery for biomass that were calibrated to on-ground measurements. As for the household survey, we sampled across 5 municipalities in Kakheti, where you see all these orange dots, but mostly in Dedo Priscado, as that is where you have the majority of winter pastures, as you can see here in the dark green. 355 households completed questionnaires were done, representing with 90% statistical confidence the underlying population, with very varying sizes of animals. We did a cluster analysis to represent major groups of pasture users, of which we will look at 4 of them, 4 of 8 total profiles in this presentation, including typical resident who has 230 sheep units, a small migrator with 400 sheep units, medium migrator with 1,000 sheep units, and large migrator with 2,500 sheep units, representing, however, only 2% of the underlying of migratory pasture users. And what we see is that there's economics of scale to herding. That is, the larger the herd size, the lower the cost per unit of production, and hence the greater the profit margins. That's the dark part here. This is in part because the costs per unit of animal, the forage cost per unit of animal declines as herd prices increase. We also see that labor costs decline per sheep unit as the number of animals increases. And as a result, whereas a small migratory pasture user may be earning 10 lari per sheep unit, a large migrating pasture user can earn up to 30 lari per sheep unit. And one of the factors contributing to the high costs of having a pastoral enterprise, specifically for the small pasture user, are the supplementary forage cost, this blue part here of the total cost curve. But we know if we improve the productivity of pastures, then we can reduce those supplementary forage costs. So let's look. Do we have any evidence of a declining trend in pasture productivity? Looking at NDVI measurements, no, we don't see any statistically significant trend for all of the winter pastures in Kakheti. However, at a very spatially explicit level, we see areas that are degrading. These red spots are degradation hotspots. And fortunately, there are various sustainable land management measures that can be employed to halt that degradation. The first of which consists of basically doing continuous grazing as we know it today, but balancing the demand for forage according to the supply of forage in the non-growing season when overgrazing and is having its hardest toll on pasture resources. So that consists of basically saying, okay, we want to ration out the total available forage during the non-growing season. And to do so, well, we firstly got to know what is the total amount of forage that's available. What is the total supply? For that purpose, we use biomass estimates from satellite imagery, on-ground measurements, and we see that for a typical year, at the outset of the non-growing season in November, there's about 400 kilo of dry matter per hectare. but only approximately 40% of that dry matter can be taken off and eaten in order to not compromise the future productivity of pastures. So in reality, in order not to lead to further degradation, the sustainable offtake is 160 kilo dry matter per hectare. Our household survey, however, showed that winter pastures have about 2.5 sheep units per hectare, which over 90 days require about 340 kilo dry matter per hectare. And that means, in reality, currently, forage demand is twice as high compared to what the winter pastures can actually provide for, which is 1.2 sheep units per hectare. So what happens then if a pasture user decides to destock to the carrying capacity of the land? Well, first, he can expect revenue from a one-off sale of livestock in the first year. That's great. He can also expect reduced supplementary feed and veterinary costs because he will have a lower herd size. However, there will also be foregone income from the future sale of livestock, cheese, and milk. And as a result of that foregone income, most, or actually all, pasture users, independently of their size, stand to lose out significantly from destocking, with small migratory pasture users basically having to go out of business, making a loss of 10 lari per sheep unit. So destocking is likely to be a very unpopular policy. However, if we imagined that pasture users were not paying lease fees for their pasture land, for using or accessing pasture land, for example, through some common property resource management scheme, then every single one of our pasture user groups would be able to remain profitable after destocking. And on top, in a longer run perspective, forest resources would start to regenerate. However, we need to also be a little bit cautious in just stipulating, at least in a top-down manner, fixed stocking densities, because we know forage resources change from year to year and site to site. So it would be good if pastoralists themselves could be empowered with the tools to measure and monitor forage availability and adjust their herd sizes accordingly. And that makes us turn to the second land management strategy, which calls for the use of multi-paddock systems, whereby you integrate recovery periods and so as to maximize forage productivity during the growing season. This approach is promoted through holistic planned grazing, and it's part of a much larger package of measures, including means to address ecological, financial, social resilience of farms and communities. But here we're only looking at a small part of that whole package of holistic planned grazing. And within holistic planned grazing, the proponents say that loss of pasture productivity and overgrazing is not a result of too many animals. It's too many animals staying around for too long time. And if you move them, and you allow the grass to recover, then you can avoid overgrazing. So you want to design these paddocks, and in order to design an optimal system, you want to know at what rate what animals consume in terms of forage, and what are the rates of recovery of forage. In terms of the measurements of how much an animal can eat, that can be done on the ground with some experiments. And in terms of the recovery rate, that varies very much from climate to climate, month to month even, and species to species. And the best is to build experience by observing really what's going on in the area where you're working. And as mentioned, forage recovery rates varies from plant to plant, and some are more slow growing than others. So if you have long grazing periods, you're likely to overgraze those slow growing plants. So you want to have those rapid moves. But if you only have 2 paddocks, in order to allow for 90 days of grazing, 90 days of recovery, you got to have 90 days of grazing. If you have 4 paddocks, you can have 30 days of grazing in any one paddock and move on to 90 days of recovery, whilst the the herd then moves to the next paddock that then have another 90 days of recovery, and so forth. So with 16 paddocks, you can have 6 days of grazing in one paddock and then 90 days of recovery afterwards. So what about Kakheti? Well, what we know is that if you allow for a maximum of 3 days of grazing in any one paddock, there's very little danger that plants will be overgrazed. We don't know about the recovery rates of plants in Kakheti because we haven't done such experiments, but we use data from a similar site in the Biga region in Turkey, where it takes about 30 days for grasses to recover in springtime and 45 to 60 days in autumn. But in case of a stronger grazing intensity, as is the case in autumn, it's better to opt for 60-day recovery. And using these parameters, what we find is that in the first year, by moving animals in paddock systems and allowing individual pastures or paddocks to recover, migrating pastoralists can expect to see a 9% increase in forage productivity, which has a value of about 80 lari per hectare that they managed in terms of avoided forage cost. And village pasture users that use the pastures all year round can expect to see a 16% increase in biomass with an avoided forage cost of 165 lari per hectare. But the true benefits are really over the long term, as both soil and biodiversity regenerates. The literature suggests that multi-paddock adaptive grazing permit a doubling of the recommended stocking rate without decreasing animal numbers or plant production. But other analysis says, by Hawkins and Brisket, says that there's no evidence to show that multi-paddock or rotational or season-long grazing is better than one another, and that they result in comparable forage production. So I think the point here is that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to sustainable pasture management, and we really got to go to the ground to do some experiments. Finally, the last sustainable land management strategy we're looking at consists of annual rotations through annual enclosures. And here we've actually drawing on data from a long-term enclosure experiment undertaken in Vashluvani protected area as part of a UNDP UN project. And what these long-term enclosure measurements have shown is that biomass productivity increases by the regeneration of biomass increases by 52 to 201% after a 1-year enclosure, depending on the pasture or the vegetation types. So assume that a pasture manager or a herder was uptaking the strategy. He could say, okay, I'm going to protect 1/4 of my land for 1 year, and next year I'll protect another 1/4 of my land. So in the first year, his effective grazing unit is reduced by 25%. In the next year, he's benefiting from the improved forage, but he still only has 3/4 of his original grazing unit available. And what that actually means is that even though we've seen forage productivity increase massively by making an enclosure, in terms of actual offtake for his animals, for 2 of the vegetation types, he's actually experiencing a decrease in total forage offtake of his animals. And only in the case of Artemisia lechiana pastures can you expect an increase in forage offtake. And as a result, over 5-year time horizon, he may lose out from doing rotational pasture grazing. And I think it is remarkable that even though we see such important regeneration of biomass, then when you account for the implied cost of reducing the effective grazing areas, farmers stand to lose despite this enhanced biomass. So I think what that means is that if we really want to incentivize land degradation neutrality, there is a case for compensating or incentivizing the uptake of sustainable land management. So in terms of our conclusion or our summaries of our results, We've seen that destocking during the non-growing season is expensive for all pasture users, and particularly small migrating pasture users. But destocking can contribute to land regeneration. Literature suggests that if you go from heavy grazing to moderate grazing at the carrying capacity of land, the productivity will increase by 20%. Our hypothetical experiment on multi-paddock systems shows that land productivity may increase as of the first year. It should also be borne in mind that the additional forage that's generated, which is not consumed, can be cut for hay, stockpiled in paddocks, and thus used to feed animal herds during the non-growing season. Finally, the third sustainable land management measure, we see that slow rotational grazing and annual enclosures is an effective way to improve land productivity, but again can be costly for pastoralists. And it should also be said that annual rotations are not recommendable on village pastures that are dominated by Bothylia chlora because it's unpalatable when dry. And NACRES specifically recommends that Bothylia chlora is continuously grazed or cut for hay before the winter. Finally, the three sustainable land management strategies do not exclude one another. They can be used in isolation or in complementarity from one year to the other, depending on the pasture user's endowments, preferences, and constraints. I will say a couple of small words as well to finalize about some potential reforms that would facilitate the uptake of these sustainable land management strategies. First and foremost, there's something to say about the mechanisms by which leaseholds are issued. What we see is that leaseholds tend to marginalize small pasture users because of economies of scale. Moreover, 25% of leases from our household survey are subleases with only 1 year duration. And this, of course, undermined any pasture user's incentive to invest in the long term. So, electronic auctioning of leaseholds to the highest bidder tend to lead to speculative behaviors and cannot guarantee land use rights of existing pasture users. Therefore, our recommendation is that any potential future leasehold allocation process should dissuade the acquisition of pastures for speculative purposes and avoid marginalizing small and Asari pastoralists. In Georgia as a whole, it should also be said, we really don't know much about what's going on. 400,000 households are registered as having livestock, but less than 100,000 have registered holdings with pastures and meadows. Finally, we've also seen that pastoralists engaging in sustainable land management practices are contributing to Georgia's land degradation neutrality targets and food and water security. As such, there is a case for compensating for their efforts to the greater public good by, for example, lowering actual lease fees, conditional improvement in productivity over time, or through conditional grants and subsidies, as well as allowing them to access education and capacity building. In that case, selected pastoralists could serve as leaders in local initiative groups and work in coordination with local institutions to facilitate local land degradation neutrality target setting and produce monitoring results. Finally, it's also important to question the individualization of pastures through leasehold in the context of mobile pastoral systems. That's because arid, semi-arid areas are characterized as common pool resources due to uneven pasture quality and distribution of water points and salt leaks. And so the ability to move over large areas is a requirement to good and sustainable pasturement, and that has been shown in various literature. Moreover, common property resource management schemes allows for pooling of resources and therefore allowing to reduce the fixed cost to individual households of herding, thereby liberating resources that they could spend in investing in sustainable land management strategies. And then at the village level, we can only say that pastures are mostly de facto commonly managed, as herds are comprised of animals belonging to multiple owners. 75% of village pasture users do not lease or own pasture land, and as such, herding is collective. In that sense, individualization of pasture makes little sense, and village pastures become good candidates for collective management, cooperative CPRM, as alternatives to individualized pasture. But we also know that in the absence of village pastures, villagers tend to use and degrade sensitive habitat such as scrubland, secondary forage, and windbreaks. Thus, there is a real case for designating village pastures for communal use. In order to do so, laws would have to change to enable municipalities to register municipal lands for pastures. The lack of a legal instrument to actually designate such municipal pastures to village users is a barrier to sustainable land management and a barrier to municipal spatial planning that of course cannot be extended to pastures when it's the agency for state property that is the manager of those state-owned pastures. In conclusion, we know though that various measures can be employed to incentivize sustainable land management by rewarding pastoralists for engaging in their regeneration of pasture resources, conditional on performance, by empowering them to be stewards of their resources through enhancing tenure security, either long-term accessible and affordable leaseholds or cooperative structures or common property resource management schemes. Finally, training and capacity building of pastoralists is also key, notably to empower them to monitor pasture resources, calculate sustainable stocking densities, or the integration of recovery rates. So I believe overall we definitely have the tools and the knowledge needed to move towards more sustainable pasture management and land degradation neutrality. I thank you so much for your attention and for the ability to do this study with all of you. Thank you. Bye.